Making sure that you make decisions about what happens to everything you own when you die and not have someone else doing it isn't that difficult. You just write one of these, a will. It's an important legal document, but even a will can be faked. And when it is, like this one, it can devastate the families involved.
Stephen Crisp recently lost his grandfather, Bob, a man who helped to bring him up.
He was a good grandfather, and I went to live with them, my granddad and my nan, when I was younger.
Bob had owned a house and had over £10,000 in savings. Several months before his death, he wrote his will, dividing his estate between his grandson Stephen and Stephen's aunt. Bob took the further precaution of providing each of them with a copy of his will and asked them both not to disclose the contents to anyone. Bob was close to Stephen, but had had a difficult relationship with his own son Nigel, Stephen's father. Just before he died, Bob asked Stephen to look after his affairs.
My grandfather, a few weeks before he passed away, gave me all his bank account details and everything for me to look after.
Immediately after Bob's death, Stephen's father, Nigel, began insisting there was no need to invite anyone to the funeral, which Stephen found strange. Soon after the funeral, Stephen needed to access his grandfather's account to cover maintenance bills on his grandfather's house, but he was in for a nasty surprise.
When I went down to the bank and I see the lady and said to her that I'm trying to get some money out of my grandfather's account, took all his details, and she was like, yeah, I'm afraid that account has been closed. I asked, how could that have been closed? And she said, well, somebody has come down here, they have used a death certificate and a will.
Bob's bank account had been emptied, his life savings, over £10,000, gone. When Stephen asked why the bank had paid out the money, he was told that someone claiming to be both the executor and beneficiary and possessing a will confirming those facts had withdrawn the money and closed the account. Stephen was furious. He immediately applied to have his grandfather's estate placed in probate. This put the process on pause, and dispersal of his grandfather's estate would have to be reviewed by a legal authority. But Stephen was in for a further shock.
I was driving past one day and I noticed 2 for sale boards outside my grandfather's house. So I rang up one of the estate agents who I know very well, and he said that your father's put it on. And I said, well, he can't, so it's in probate. And that was when I decided then that, you know, enough's enough.
Seeing that his father was only weeks away from selling the property, valued at £135,000, Stephen contacted the police. His case was dealt with by DC Jill Lacey.
I went and met Stephen myself, spent quite a lengthy time talking to him and other members of the family, after which it became fairly apparent that indeed a fraud had taken place, and there ensued the criminal investigation.
DC Lacey conducted a search of Nigel and Jenny Crisp's house. She recovered what she suspected was the fake will. The case would hinge on being able to prove the will Stephen had was real and the one recovered from his parents' house was fake.
This is a copy of the will that was written by the offender. These documents can be downloaded from an internet for a small fee. They can be purchased in supermarkets. All that needs is for the document to be witnessed, taken along to a financial institution, as was in this case, and the money is accessed and it's gone.
Conveniently, the 2 witnesses who'd signed the fake will were both dead. If DC Lacey was to prove the will was indeed a fake, she'd need conclusive evidence. She decided to have a handwriting expert examine the will. Handwriting samples were taken from both suspects, and those samples, along with the suspected fake will, were sent to be analysed.
These are some handwriting specimens written by one of the suspects. They were written for the police, and they contained several lines of the text that is present within the will.
It was clear to the analyst that Nigel Crisp's handwriting and the handwriting used in the suspect fake will were remarkably similar.
It wasn't particularly sophisticated. It was simply a document that was written out in more or less the person's normal handwriting. It wasn't particularly disguised. It was maybe a little bit carefully written, but I've seen many documents that are much more disguised than this one.
The handwriting proved to be Nigel's, Stephen's father. This gave DC Lacey the conclusive piece of evidence she needed. Nigel and Jenny Crisp maintained their innocence throughout the investigation, but once the case came to court, they admitted their guilt. Nigel admitted the offence of making a false instrument, while Jenny admitted to using a false instrument with intent. Both received suspended sentences and have been ordered to repay Stephen Crisp and his aunt £16,000. Criminal cases which set members of a single family against each other are particularly difficult for both the family members involved and the police officers investigating.
The pain that has caused it's just been horrendous.
You're asking people to provide information to an investigation against a father, a mother, any other relative, and it's really quite difficult. But I think there's always going to have to be a good reason for doing that, and I feel in this case that there was.
Over the last few years, an increasing number of fake wills have been used to steal inheritances. Nigel and Jenny Crisp used a will template downloaded from the internet to create their fake will. So, has the availability of do-it-yourself wills made making a fake one all too easy? And what can you do to protect your will? Richard Roberts is one of the UK's leading experts on wills, and he currently chairs the Law Society's Wills Committee.
Fake wills are certainly on the increase. Part of that is down to the fact that it is now easier to create a fake will, primarily because you can use the internet to create a will, and therefore unscrupulous relatives are using that as a means.
And Richard has some advice for anyone planning to make a will.
In Stephen's case, I think the real key point there was that the will was made by a solicitor. And of course, as a lawyer, I'm bound to say that it's the right thing to have a solicitor make your will. But in this case, it really was helpful because that solicitor had a valid will with a proper signature on. It was therefore very much easier for the police to uncover that sort of fraud.
Six months after seeing his parents' fakery exposed, Stephen has been able to sell his grandfather's house and is moving on with his life. But repairing family ties is going to take some time.
My mother, she will come over and see me still, even after what she has done. I still try my hardest to keep a relationship with her.
And for Stephen's oldest son, Thomas, who used to visit his grandparents, the family discord has been unsettling.
We just have to try and work through it as a family with him and, you know, help him get over it, and also, you know, to help Stephen as well, because he's got no contact with his dad anymore.
Stephen still muses on what his grandfather would make of the sequence of events that followed his death.
I know he wouldn't be surprised of what has happened. He did warn us before he passed away that we need to watch Nigel as he knew what he was capable of.